Welcome, everyone. Yeah, thanks, Columbia, for hosting us. Thank you, Sarah Knapp, for creating this beautiful, wonderful outdoor fest. Now 5 years was awesome. Just really quickly on Outdoor Fest, you know, it's amazing. I've been guiding based in New York City, working upstate in the Catskills for about 10 years, and seeing the increase in love for the outdoors and the increase in use is simply amazing. And what New York City had been lacking up until Outdoor Fest was somewhere that the entire outdoor community could, you know, coalesce around. You know, we're not like Boulder where there's going to be 50% of the people are outdoorsy, but with 8 million, you only need a small fraction. So it's events like this that bring us together that's really fantastic. So again, I'm Dave. I co-own Destination Backcountry Adventures. I can say co-own now? Destination Backcountry Adventures. Yes, yes. I'm now co-owner because I married our director of marketing last weekend, and she is now part owner as well. Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Jessica will be in doing trip planning essentials tomorrow evening, I believe. I think we're trading off tomorrow night. But we're here tonight for Psychology of Survival. So just real quickly, and this can be a hand raise or shout out, who is learning Psychology of Survival because they think they're going to find themselves in a survival situation someday? Yeah? Okay, good. I'd like to see that. That means some people are going to be pushing their boundaries in here or plan to. Who's interested in learning about psychology of survival because they think that things like that can be useful in a day-to-day life as well? Yeah, it totally can. It really is. It's very interesting. So what I like to say when it comes to survival, I also teach skills. You know, the fire without matches, shelter, water, signaling, trapping food, and all that. But what we're going to cover tonight is, in a lot of ways, a lot more important than those hard skills. There are countless examples of people who have found themselves in survival situations with all of the training, all of the skills, and all of the gear. And they either got themselves horribly messed up or killed because they didn't have the ability to get themselves into a good mental frame of mind and make good decisions. There are equal number of scenarios in which people with no training, experience, or skills found themselves in survival situations, managed to keep their wits about them, and just through observation, cool-headed thinking, were able to get themselves out of it. So what we cover in Psychology of Survival, I like to say this is a way of understanding how to tame your animal nature. If you do ever find yourself in a survival situation, you essentially revert back to an animal. We lose the last 200,000 years of Homo sapien evolution, and we really do become primal beasts again. You know, I like to say that we don't have claws, we don't have fangs, venom, fur, we can't jump and run like other animals. The reason we dominate this planet is because of our minds. So when you do find yourself in a survival situation, what you really have to do is bring back your human nature. And I think to really understand this, you have to understand what's going on in your body when you're in a survival scenario. And what it is it's evolution. So when we panic, you know, our heart rate increases. Your liver drops a good shot of glucose in your blood system because your body thinks you're either going to run away from a bear or fight a lion or something like that. When in reality, in a survival situation, you need to do almost the exact opposite. So I always like to start off Psychology of Survival with telling a story about how I made my first survival situation much worse than it needed to be. So I'll bring you back about 12, 15 years. I had been working as a corporate executive in publishing, and I knew I wanted out. So I left my job, and I took time off, and I spent about 6 months out west traveling around, hiking, backpacking different wilderness areas and national parks. I knew I wanted to work outdoors, but I didn't know in what capacity. So I planned about 8 hikes that were all between 7 and 14 days. So I did my first one in Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado. It was awesome. Then I was headed down further south to the San Juan Range near Durango and Silverton in Colorado. And did what you're supposed to do, called the ranger, checked in the latest conditions. Again, this is a hike that I had planned in detail in my apartment in Brooklyn, you know, poring over maps, guidebooks, looking up stuff on the internet. I called the ranger and I said, hey, you know, I'm heading down. I want to know latest conditions. And he cut me off about a sentence and he goes, you're not going there. And I went, well, you know, I'm pretty experienced. You know, he goes, no, I was out there a week ago. There's an enormous wall of snow, a cornice over a pass. He goes, you can't be under that when it goes. It's going sometime soon. Plan a different route. So, all right. Snow, I better head further south. Let's go to New Mexico and see what's in New Mexico. So I go into Taos and stay in a hotel, and the next day I go in our gear shop. Where should I hike? I'm looking for remoteness. The guy says, if you want remote, there's a wilderness not far from here. There are no trails. Are you comfortable with map and compass? I said, oh yeah. I know how to navigate with map and compass, no problem at all. Because again, you have a really wild experience here. You definitely won't see other people. Awesome, exactly what I'm looking for. So yeah, it was. I mean, it was great. You know, the national parks are wonderful, but you see other people in national parks. So I sort of alternating wilderness area and national park. It was supposed to be a 7-day hike, and it was on my 6th day, and I'm making my way back out. Conditions were late winter, early spring, so there were big drifts of snow, which will become relevant in a minute, but mostly bare ground. So I'm on my 6th day, I'm hiking back to my car. Had a great trip. I'm looking forward to getting to Albuquerque, getting showered up and get a meal. And I'm walking, it's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and you just get that sinking feeling that something's not right, which is usually how most survival situations start. And that's a good, the minute you have that sinking feeling, just stop. We'll get to that in a second. So I stopped, and I went, let me check my map and compass. I was wearing, typical hiking shorts, multiple pockets. I reach into my right thigh pocket where map and compass always is, pull the map out, don't feel the compass. Stop again. All right, no compass. Starting to panic a little more. You get that, your hair starts to rise, you get a little shiver. So immediately sit down, empty all my pockets. I must have put it in a different pocket, not there. Pull the backpack off that I put in here. I'm starting to panic more and more now. Because I'm aware that I'm in a wilderness with no trails, and I have a map, but no compass. So I start to panic. And at that point, my body went into survival mode. I was compelled to do something. So rather than carefully plan my thought up, I pack everything out and I go, you know what? I'm sure the turn I'm looking for, I was looking for a valley to turn into. I'm sure that it's just ahead, which is like that urge to do something. So I pick up my pace and I start moving quicker. I don't see it. So then I decide, okay, I should get to the top of something, see if I can find a viewpoint, I can lay down my map, orient it, I'll be able to get it right way. So I see the first hill that I can go up to. So I sprint up it because I'm positive there's gonna be a view at the top. I run up, I get to the top, winded and exhausted, totally screened in. Okay, keep moving. Rinse and repeat for about 2 hours. And I'm just getting...
You never thoroughly looked through your bag.
Never thoroughly looked through it. I thought to myself, the last time I had my compass was about 2 or 3 hours ago. So I did quickly think, do I want to backtrack on the hopes of finding it? I know that I'm close to where I want to be. So I made the decision to push on. And again, it turned out to probably be the right decision to push on rather than backtrack, but it wasn't a clear-headed decision. I did it because the adrenaline in my system was telling me to do that. So I kept going, and I was really wearing myself down, both physically and mentally. I'm sprinting up to the top of these hills every time I see one, and then I get to the top and I'm just crushed emotionally and mentally because it's all screened in. So to give you an idea, there were big snow drifts. So even though the ground is mostly bare, every now and then you have to cross a big, like 4 to 6 foot berm of snow. And as I'm running around looking at these, I see one of these with boot tracks crossing it. I'm like, oh my God, this must be it. So I run right to there. And I look at my own boots and I go, I'm like Winnie the Pooh on this. Like, oh, Eeyore, we've circled back around. So at that point, it's about 3 hours later, and I stop, and I'm so crushed by this that I just sit down. And I had basically worn the adrenaline and the blood sugar out of my system at that point. And then it hit me. I went, I have my backpack. I have a tent, I have a sleeping bag, I have a water filter. I probably have some leftover oatmeal and trail mix. It's time to just make camp for the night, try this in the morning again. So I get into my tent and beat the crap out of myself that night, so hard on myself mentally. What are you doing? You should get out of the woods, call Harcourt and beg for your job back. You have no business working in the woods. You lost your compass on an off-trail trip. Like, how stupid can you be? Really, and I get into this because it's important, because that was really counterproductive at the time. It seemed like the most natural thing in the world. I did something wrong. I should be beating myself up for it. So I wake up the next morning, make a cup of tea, see which way the sun is rising. I'm like, well, that's east. Orient the map, trying to get a good sense of it, and I go, all right, I think I know what I did wrong yesterday. So I start off, and sure enough, I basically I thought that I should have seen the turn. I was about a quarter mile short. So I kept moving back. So the next morning, and about 2 inches of snow had fallen that night. So going to be relevant to the story in a second. So as I'm hiking out, I go, I recognize this. I recognize this. I'm about a mile from my car. So as I'm getting close to the car, I see fresh bear tracks. Now, there are no grizzly bears in New Mexico, but if I didn't know that for a fact, I would have thought it was a grizzly track, because I didn't know black bears got that big. We're talking my hand and a good 2 inches further on every claw. And I'm looking at this, I'm like, this is fresh snow. She was here like recently. So I get closer to my car, and I see some garbage blowing across the freshly snow. And I went, who was out here? Who could be littering? I get to my car. The lift gate is open in the back. One of the windows is smashed. And now, mind you, I was on a 6-month road trip. So I didn't pack all of the food for 6 months, but I bought a lot of stuff in bulk. Like, I got the Costco size honey and peanut butter. So that, like, oh, I'll just go back and refill my little container after every hike. the bear had ravaged the car. There are claw marks in the upholstery from where she had levered herself in to get further in. And I'm looking at the car. So this is interesting. So I've never heard of anything like this before. The only thing I'd heard similar to that was in Yosemite, the rangers caught a bear using her claws to lever and lift windshields up. But a bear smashing glass is unheard of. So I'm thinking to myself, this is insane. I've never heard of anything like this. I'm looking around the car and all I see are bear tracks all around the car. This is crazy. So I go, all right, I guess I'll go to Albuquerque and go to like Safe Light and get my glass replaced. And then I'll check into a hotel and I should really call the ranger and tell them about this bear behavior. And I thought, check into a hotel, oh, that'll be great. I'll get a shower and change. And I went, wait a minute, where's my suitcase? Because I had like civilized clothes as well. I went, on top of that, where's my fishing gear, my snowshoes? And I realized humans must have broken into my car first. I didn't realize it because they must have broken in 2 or 3 nights ago. The fresh snow fell, so all I saw were the bear tracks. And then about 30 seconds later, it hits me. If I hadn't lost my compass, I would have gotten back to the car the previous night at like 4 or 5 o'clock. I would have said, well, I'm not going to drive to Albuquerque now. The glass places will be closed. I'll sleep in the car or next to the car. I like to think that I would have been smart enough to go, oh, this is like 40,000 calories of food. Maybe I should camp 200 yards over there in case a wild animal shows up. But I don't know that I would have. You know, I probably, because you don't know how you would respond in that shock of like, oh my God, I've been burglarized. Also, for the record, the only time in 20 years of hiking, 12 of it professionally, that I've ever experienced any trailhead theft, just for the record. The outdoor community tends to be. And on top of that, I was warned about this area being prone to trailhead theft because it's in an area of high poverty. But anyway, that's not super tangent to the story.
You might have been killed by either people or
Yep.
bear.
Wow. Maybe beating the shit out of myself mentally last night wasn't a great idea. So I started to think about it, how that would have affected my positive mental attitude after that. So I thought about all of this and I realized I made a lot of poor decisions. And then as I got into outdoor leadership and I started teaching other people, I realized, well, what can I learn from this? What could I have done differently that would help people in that situation? And what would be universal to all stressful situations? So being the mind that I am, I like to research things. So I went into a whole research wormhole about the human response to stress. And then that led into a whole thing about heuristics and how we make decisions and how we make them under pressure and what kind of biases we have and fail to account for. So bearing that in mind, I realized, well, not only am I going to be guiding and potentially leading people into a situation where we might be in a survival situation. I've never had a group in a survival situation. I've treated some pretty nasty injuries that were close, but never quite. So I started thinking about this, and then as my company grew and I started training other guides, I wanted to come up with a good system that would be useful, sort of a quick reference that you could get into should you ever find yourself in a survival situation. And since I've been teaching this, I've actually had people tell me that they use this more often, like at their desk when they show up and there's like, oh, I've got 3 things that are all equally urgent. It's 8 o'clock on a Monday morning and I'm starting to panic. A little bit that I've developed on how we can tame that. So I have about 20 handouts here. At the end, I'll be glad to take email addresses. Not only are we doing a raffle, but I can follow up and send this PDF along. So if you want to maybe take one and pass it through, as you might imagine, I've got it memorized, so I can start on it. An acronym is always great. So the acronym for our psychology survival is ADAPT, A-D-A-P-T. And ADAPT is wonderful because right off the bat, it reminds you that to survive, you must adapt. If you're in a survival situation, you are going to be faced with a scenario that you did not prepare for. No matter how prepared you are, you can never possibly be ready for every scenario that might be out there. Incidentally, I always carry a second compass sealed in my survival kit now at this point so that no matter what happens. And also, for the record, what I think happened was when I was crossing one of those big snow berms, the snow just pushed up on my leg and just slid the compass right out. So somewhere in the Cruces Basin wilderness is a really nice Sunto compass just weathering in the sun right there. And adapt is how we survive. So the first A is for acknowledge that you're in a survival situation and lucky to be alive. So if you ever are in the real world or in the backcountry and you ask yourself the question, is this a survival situation? It only has one answer. The answer is never no. The answer is always yes, because you don't do yourself any harm by going into the following protocol that I'm going to get into. You may go through the entire thing and realize like, oh, wait a minute, okay, I think the trail's about a half mile back there, walk back out. But better to do that than to think, no, I've got this, and then wind up, additionally further lost or injured or whatever the case might be. So acknowledge you're in a survival situation and lucky to be alive. that second part really is important because it puts you in the idea of positive mental attitude. If you're going to make it through any survival situation, whether it's one night unexpected in the woods or possibly 2 or 3 nights waiting for rescue, your positive attitude is what is going to keep you alive. I mentioned earlier that there are examples of people who have no survival experience surviving situations. My favorite one that I know of is a woman, she was a mother driving with 3 children in Utah at the beginning of a blizzard. She was trying to make it home before the worst of the storm hit. She ran off the road at the beginning of the storm, no injuries. The car was about 100 feet down a ditch. And she realized very quickly, we can try and leave the car and get back up to the road and hope to signal someone, but we could get further injured doing that. I think the best bet is to stay put. And so for the next 2 days, she kept the children entertained by playing games. They would have like, okay, well, we have this amount of food. Let's play a game to do these things. No experience. She observed what was going on. She noticed that the side of the car that was buried in snow seemed to be warmer than the rest of the car. So she observed what outdoor professionals know. Snow is an awesome insulator. So she packed snow around the sides of the car, realizing you need to leave room for venting. She really made some really intelligent decisions and got out just fine. The book is called Deep Survival, if you'd like to read some of these stories. It's really pretty impressive, and it's a great book. It's a very easy read, Deep Survival. Remiss that I can't remember the author's name off the top of my head. But she acknowledged she was in a survival situation, lucky to be alive, and basically had the children convinced of that. Like, wow, we had a horrible car accident, but God was looking out for us, and here we are safe and sound, and we just have to wait for Providence to deliver us. She happened to be a religious person, so that was part of it for her. So it worked. So acknowledge you're in a survival situation and lucky to be alive. That also puts you in a positive frame of mind, which is going to help you tame the panic that is trying to overtake your brain and body at that point. So the second letter in the acronym is D, for don't panic, and right on the heels of that, don't move. Does anyone know The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? So it's not a totally dated reference, that's awesome. Right on the front cover is don't panic, and it's good advice. You're going to panic. You can acknowledge that panic, but acknowledge it and say, this is coming from my body. My mind controls my body. I'm gonna use my mind to control my body. And then you sort of get into this whole system. Everyone has a different way of finding a peaceful place. A guy that I know who did search and rescue in Denali for a long time, he quit smoking cigarettes when he was a senior in high school. I met him after he graduated college, and he has a cigarette in his survival kit. And I asked him, I said, Andy, what's that for? And he goes, well, I always felt if I ever really get deep in the shit, I can always have the cigarette to calm my mind. And he said, or more likely what I would do is say, okay, I'm going to have half of that cigarette once I set up a shelter for the night, and just sort of have that be the carrot on the end of his stick. And it's really interesting to hear that. I was telling this story, I was doing psychology survival, I guess about 2 years ago, and someone raised their hand, said they had a great story to share. His friend was a lawyer out in LA. By the way he told the story, I got the impression pretty well off and high powered, and he's going through a really nasty divorce. So he made what we call a Y chromosome decision. Just sort of was like, I'm gonna go be a man and find myself in the desert and work through all of this in my mind. Water's rare, or it can be difficult to find in Joshua Tree. And on like his 3rd day, he meant to be traveling 12 miles to his next camp where there was water. He went, he went 12 miles and got to where he was, realized he had gone the wrong way. So realized then, and there was no water, so he had like a half a liter of water. He wasn't lost. He knew where he had to go, but he realized, I have about a 1/10 of the water I'm gonna need to travel these now 24 miles backwards. So he was in a survival situation. He did make some good decisions. He realized immediately, I'm not gonna move in the middle of the day. Between 10 and 3 in the afternoon, I'm finding shade. So he hiked in the mornings, hiked at dusk, and made his way back. And he was saying on the last day, he hadn't had water in about 12 hours, and he's trudging across the desert. And his mantra was, if I die out here, she gets everything. If I die out here, she gets everything. So it's really, but it's really, whatever it takes to keep you motivated. I think it's pretty good. I'll probably add a picture of my adorable puppy to my survival kit now, so I can be motivated to come back. A picture of my wife is already in there, so we'll bring it on top of it. So these are your first 2. You've acknowledged you're in a survival situation. You've said to yourself, I'm really lucky to be alive, which will be easier if you're the only survivor from a plane wreck or something like that. You go, damn, I am the lucky one. But listen, if you are alive to be in a survival situation, you are lucky because the alternative could always be so much worse. So now you're starting to get yourself into a good state of mind. Your heart rate's probably still a little bit up, but maybe you don't feel that it's pounding against your chest anymore. Your breathing might be a little quick, but you're doing some exercise to get it under control. And you think that you're in a good state of mind to start actively working towards your survival, which when you are ready to do that, it can really make you feel pretty good. And one of the best things you can start out with is assessing what you have on you. Some people say start with assessing your risks. I say unless there's a very obvious and immediate danger, start with assessing what you have on you, because knowing that you do have some resources can always make you feel better. And I find that when people go through this assessment of their resources, they can generally find they have a lot more than they think they do. So I say, so Les Stroud, the Survivor Man, the original one, the only one that I personally have any respect for, he talks about the 3 zones of assessment. I've modified these a little bit. For me, the first zone of assessment is your body. For him, it's whatever you're carrying. I like to start with checking out your body. So that scenario I gave you in New Mexico, it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon when I realized that. 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a day that I thought I was gonna be eating in a restaurant for dinner that night. So I probably didn't have a huge lunch. I was eager to get out, so I probably wasn't stopping and hydrating every hour like I was supposed to. So when I started that scenario, I was probably a little low blood sugar and a little dehydrated. The best thing I could have done was to sit down, eat a granola bar, and sip half a quart of water. I didn't. I started running. If you have a little bit of food, eat it. You're really, in a survival scenario, people like to think about food. It's not one of your greatest concerns. If you have a granola bar and you're hungry and you find yourself, go ahead, at least eat half of it because it's gonna make you feel better. And also, the act of digestion tends to slow your mind down a little bit. It's that whole, like, I just had a big meal and I can't even think. If you're already amped up and you have a little meal, just bring you down a little bit. So assess what kind of situation your body's in. This is very important if your survival situation is due to an injury. Like, I just broke my leg, so this is the biggest thing to start with. But that's where it starts, with your person. That's your first zone of assessment. Second zone of assessment is anything that you're carrying, either on your person or in your backpack. Empty it out. I know it sounds crazy. It's one thing to go, I've got my wallet, I've got my keys, put them in front of you. And the reason for that is, once you see things, in your mind, you're like, I have my wallet, it's for purchasing things. If you have it out and emptied in front of you, you might look at the contents of it a little bit differently. And, I thought that was on silent, my apologies. I was doing a survival course for a corporate group about a year ago, and I had everyone at the stage, I said, so empty your pockets, tell me what you have in front of you. And people are, I have this. And I get to one guy, he goes, I got nothing here. And he had his wallet and his keys, and he really technically had nothing. I said, really nothing? He goes, nothing. I said, well, how much do you think you'd pay for dry tinder if you were in a survival situation? Oh, I don't know. I said, would you pay $20 for dry tinder? Yeah, absolutely. Says, take the $20 out of the wallet. I'm like, this is made of cotton and paper. If you shred this up, this is tinder. Oh my God, I never would have thought of it that way. Right. That's why you want to have it out in front of you. You think a little more creatively. That's also why it's important to get yourself in a good state of mind before you do this, because when you are in a survival situation, when I say that you revert to animal, you really do, not only mentally. In a survival situation, evolution goes, well, thinking creatively is not going to help you. You need to make split-second decisions. So you lose your ability to think creatively. Your body becomes very quick at making decisions, but then you get into that immediacy bias, like, well, that was the idea that popped into my head first, so it must be the right one. That's not usually the case. So calming yourself can be very, very important for that, to show how much you revert to an animal. You lose your peripheral vision. Your body becomes very good at bicameral forward vision, and again, it's like, all right, if I'm fighting a lion, I need to focus on the lion. I don't need anything on the sides distracting me. If you're in a survival situation, observation is one of your greatest powers. So if you find yourself, just really very narrowly focused on what's ahead of you, understand that that's a physical symptom of the survival situation that you're in. So again, you have your potential resources laid out in front of you. Hopefully you're looking at things to repurpose them. This could be something as simple as like, you might have a magnifying glass attached to, you'd be surprised, like they're on all, or a whistle was the other thing I'm thinking of. Whistles are everywhere now. I see them, like a lot of backpacks have them right there in the sternum strap. That is one of the most amazing gear hacks I've ever seen. The idea of having something that you can call for rescue, like 6 inches from your mouth. The idea that like you fall, break your leg, or break an arm, you may not be able to get your pack off to blow a whistle. That you can just reach down. This is really cool. I have no idea which manufacturer started it, but kudos to them. Your third zone of assessment is what is available to you in the environment. Your biggest concerns in most survival situations are going to be environmental, in that you're going to need to deal with thermal challenges, too hot, too cold, which usually is remedied with shelter, fire, and water, depending on which way you need to go. So look around you. We work primarily in New York State, Catskills, and Adirondacks. I can't sit and imagine a scenario in which water would not be available in those two places. It's pretty uncommon. Additionally, particularly in the Catskills, we have a lot of sedimentary rock. There are often rock overhangs that are 2 or 3 feet deep, so shelter's available. In addition to that, there's debris everywhere. There's logs, leaves, branches. In a survival situation, it's totally kosher to cut some live branches to line your shelter. We don't do it when we teach, but the resources are there for you. So look around and think. That can also be, is there a trail nearby? If rescue, will I be able to call for rescue? Things like that. So now you're assessing your resources. Then you have to assess, okay, what are my challenges? And I mentioned thermal challenges are a big thing. People are very surprised at how quickly hypothermia can onset and at how warm of a temperature you can get seriously chilled. We were out yesterday in the Catskills. It was in the 60s. We had a passing shower come in on us. Everybody got just a little damp, not soaked to the bone, but 60 degrees and wet. Everybody's like, whoa, I got a little chilly. If you know the story of Aaron Ralston down in Utah, the guy who basically gnawed his own arm off, all he needed to do was tell one person, I'm going rock climbing. I expect to be back tonight. But instead, no one knew where he was. He was in a horrible situation. I mean, this is my backup knife. This is when I keep my survival. This is probably twice as long and 3 times as sharp as the one he used to amputate his own arm. It's really mind-boggling. He needed to break the arm first, and then I don't like telling the story because it's a little visceral.
If
but
you wrote this as a fiction,
no one will believe it. Nope. It's like the story that The Revenant was based on, the story of Hugh Glass. That's a true story. The Revenant, they actually managed somehow to make the story less badass than the true story. Like usually Hollywood goes the opposite direction. The actual true story of Hugh Glass was even more impressive. That was also the role that made me finally respect Leonardo DiCaprio, but that's neither here nor there. It's an awesome movie. If you guys haven't seen The Revenant, it's definitely worth seeing. And you talk about the human will for survival, or read the actual true story of Hugh Glass. If we have a little time towards the end, I'll be happy to talk about that a little bit too. So you're now looking for rescue. Typically, if you told someone when to expect you home and or you are injured, your best bet is probably to stay put. If you're reasonably confident that you were just a little turned around like I was, you can then say, okay, I'm still facing a challenge, but I'm going to do so sort of on my terms. With me, it was, I probably could have continued walking around that night, and I might have eventually gone the extra third of a mile and found the valley I was looking for. But I also might have made it much worse. I might have walked myself off a cliff in dusk or anything like that. Or just tripped. I mean, that's it. And that's a really good point. When you're in a survival situation that consists of you being lost or turned around, that's one thing. When you're in a survival situation and you're injured on top of it,
and you're going like this.
Yep.
You're not looking at what's going
and that's
on
it.
in front of
So,
you.
and that's exactly it. That's why I always stress it's so important to really get your mind in a good place. It was only because I have a guardian angel with like wings of gold, I think, that was keeping me from, I think back then I was walking off trail. It wasn't even like I was like running through the woods trying to find a viewpoint so I could orient my map to something that I recognized. Okay, so now you are ADAPT. So we have acknowledged we're alive, we have not panicked, and we have assessed what our needs are. And now we're looking to get to the P. We're looking to plan our rescue. Again, most of the time, that's going to be self-rescue. Some of the times in which it would be better, I was just alluding to sit still. If you're injured, you're not going to have a choice. That's definitely the best case. If someone's looking for you, that's a big case. One of the scenarios that I give, because it happens a lot in the Catskills, people get lost a lot in the fall. And the reason for that is because the trails become obscured with leaves. In the Catskills, when you're at high elevation, a lot of times the trails will be what are basically seasonal drainages. If you're on them in April, they're rivers with the snowmelt, but any other time of the year, it's just dry, it's a dry riverbed. And those typically you'll go down the first 500 or 600 feet of elevation, and then there'll be a turn where the drainage continues down and becomes a river further down, and then off to the right or to the left is the actual trail. I've done this myself. It's a beautiful fall day. You've got great conversation. You're not looking at the ground because you don't really see the trail anyway with all the leaves. And wait, I haven't seen a blaze in a while. Wait, are we still on the trail? And then you realize like, ooh, I'm not sure how long ago we left the trail. If you find yourself in that scenario at 2 o'clock, probably best off just walking right back up the ravine, looking for the trailblazers. You find yourself in that scenario at 5 o'clock. You just go, time to hunker down. And again, an uncomfortable night in the woods, like shivering next to a tiny little fire, or no fire, even that is going to be a lot better than, continuing down. Because this one drainage I'm thinking off of Hunter Mountain, if you miss the turn, you wind up 12 miles on the other side of the mountain. I mean, you're really pretty deep into it. So you're planning how to get rescued. There are scenarios in which you can start to say, okay, I think I'm going to go with self-rescue. In that scenario, just then, you and maybe 2 friends spend an uncomfortable night in the Catskills. You're pretty sure that you can find the trail the next morning. You may start hiking the next morning, realize you still can't find it, and then at that point, you know what? We're going to sit still. We're going to start signaling for rescue, whether it's 3 blasts on a whistle, actually doing something a little more like putting out using a mirror to flash for planes, but more often than not, your whistle or your voice is your best tool for signaling for rescue.
Flares and stuff?
Not flares. I will get into a little bit what I carry in my survival kit, but just since we mentioned it, this is a Mylar blanket, like you see them wrapping on marathon runners at the end. Like a lot of things in the survival kit, it's going to be multi-purpose. This, for me, is wonderful if I'm injured or somebody else is injured. This is going to be a great way to reflect and retain heat. If I need to, it's very shiny and silver. I don't want to open it up completely, but the other side's a bright, shiny, reflective silver. If you need to, you can tear this into strips, and this will show up very well for anyone who's looking for you from above. We'll get a little more into what the principles of rescue are, but the rule to remember, if you only remember one thing about rescue, 3 is the universal symbol for distress. So 3 blasts on a whistle, 3 pieces of Mylar tied, preferably in some unnatural pattern. So, for example, if a plane sees 1 piece of Mylar in a tree, the pilot might assume, all right, somebody lost a balloon, anything. If a pilot sees 3 strips in a triangle, they're going to immediately rate off rescue because that's unmistakable. And even pilots are trained, if you see something like that, better to call it in and find out that it was garbage after the fact than wait and have someone going longer for rescue. I would recommend, if you don't have a whistle on that, that is a crucial piece of gear. I teach the guides loud bird calls, so if our hands aren't broken, we can whistle very loudly with them. I always say skills are better than gear because you can't really lose skills. The skills don't break. But you don't need to learn like crazy bird calls. Just a little whistle will be awesome. It weighs next to nothing. It's a great thing to have. So your plan is generally going to be, how am I going to make sure that my body doesn't reach an uncomfortable temperature? Again, because we're in the Northeast, at least 10 of the 12 months out of the year, getting cold is going to be an issue. And it sounds weird to think that even in like June or September, but the group we had out overnighting this weekend, beautiful day on Saturday. It was hot, humid, but it was warm. Sunday was warm, at least in the 70s, but you don't think that as you're like sweating all day Saturday, like, oh, it could get to hypothermia weather tonight, no problem. But it can. So finally, I do want to cover some of the main things that we do. Do a quick time check. 7:20, cool. And Sarah, I just want to double check if I'm going to 8 or 8:30. I thought it was 8:30, but I think Columbia closes. I'll make sure I don't go over. Cool. Yep. So the last letter in the acronym before we actually get into things like fire, water, shelter, things like that, is T. And that's for thoughtful action. And I didn't put thoughtful on there just to make the acronym work, although it does help. The idea with that is thoughtful action. Everything you're doing should have a purpose. And if you're doing something and you can't justify to yourself why you're doing it or where it ranks in your list of priorities, stop and assess. And it's also like the whole acronym ADAPT. It's to remind you that we're humans. Our minds and our ability to adapt is what has allowed us to get this far to dominate the planet, and will really allow you at any point to get out of it. So before I jump into some of the actual things, fire, water, shelter, and where they rank in the list of hierarchy of priorities, I'd be happy to take a couple questions at this point. Yep.
Those steri pens, like you said, you use water everywhere, but
Yep.
do they work?
They do. And just to touch on water
Do they all work,
real quick.
or
They all
just
work,
certain-
yeah. So a couple principles, we can just jump right to that. Water is going to be one of your big concerns while you're out there. And what I always say, if you are in a survival situation and you are dehydrated, drink whatever you find. It is, because the most common thing you're worried about is a parasite called Giardia. That's the most common one that you get in the backcountry. And more importantly, it takes about 7 to 14 days to get symptomatic. So the idea is that if you're still in a survival situation in 7 days, when you become symptomatic, that's going to be the least of your problems because you've been in a survival scenario for 7 days. So go ahead and drink the water. Having said that, there are some rules like, stagnant water. Clear and running doesn't guarantee that it's not contaminated, but it certainly lessens the chances. But a SteriPen's awesome.
But they work.
They work. Oh yeah.
So yeah,
Yep.
bring like 5 of those.
Yep.
Just to make
Yep.
sure
Equally good though. And again, because you can always carry enough gear. Like I carry a water filter, whenever I go in the woods. I don't always use it because I know its springs are safe to drink from and such, but I always have it. A SteriPen would be great to have in your survival kit.
And that's different from what you said. You just sterilize.
I carry like a full pump that can be used not just for emergencies but for a group. I just pump like this and it'll purify water.
Oh.
But that's about 14 ounces, so it's heavy to have in your survival kit. But for a survival straw, that's basically. I had a straw kicking around there somewhere. Do you guys see a little metal straw over there where I was sitting? If you do, awesome. If not, no big deal.
But 14 ounces isn't that bad if it's much easier or gives you more water.
Yep.
or
Well, and the other things too, so this lets us segue into fire as well, why I rank fire so high on the list of things. If you have fire and you have even a small container, a little metal container, most pros that I know pack their survival kit in a tin cup or something else that can be heated because boiling will kill everything and anything. Boiling won't remove chemical contaminants from water, but 99% of the time you're not in an area where chemical contamination is an issue. So if you have a method of boiling water, that's all you need for water purification. But again, often in a survival situation, you might not even have that. Drink the water. It's, and I've had Giardia. It's not pleasant, but it's not fatal. You don't want to be away from indoor plumbing while you have the symptoms, but it's not fatal for most people. So that was good. Other questions before I go into some of the actual things? You feel like, okay, if I can just get myself into a good state of mind. This also goes the same with if you have a little bit of food. So the principles would be the same. And the question is really, is it better to go ahead and give yourself the boost of energy / hydration, or is it better to conserve? My answer would depend on the situation that I'm in. If it's a warm, muggy day and I have a half a liter of water left and I think, all right, this may be the only purified water I have for the next 24 hours, I might conserve a little bit, provided I feel good at that point. But if I'm already a little dehydrated, I'm probably going to drink at least half of that because I want to give myself the best leg up to be in a good state of mind. Dehydration won't kill you usually in less than about 3 days or so, but in as few as 12 hours, your decision-making process can really be affected.
You become useless.
You do. I was actually really surprised. The first time I got myself severely dehydrated, I had been off trail, and I got to the trail, and it was as simple as, do I go left or do I go right? And I have map, compass, and I knew how to use them very well. And I was so dehydrated that I couldn't actually figure out, because I thought about it, like, I'll just make a right. And I actually had to take my map and compass out, orient it to the landscape, line everything up and go, yeah, no, that's it, it's a right. But I really couldn't function. And I had only been dehydrated for about 12 hours at that point. So that comes pretty quickly. So I think it would really depend on how you feel. Having said that, the burst of adrenaline and everything you get in a survival scenario, you actually need to hydrate to get some of those byproducts of the hormones out of your body. So that the actual act of going into survival mode does require some water just to sort of get you through it. If I'm reasonably hydrated, then I might just sip that last half a quart for as long as I can make it last. But again, if at any point I felt like, wow, I'm really getting to the point where I'm not thinking clear, that's when you'd use the rest of it and say, now my biggest priority. And to show you how thoughtful action goes into work, say that you had that half a liter of water and you expected to hike out within 36 hours. And at the beginning of that 36 hours, you felt okay. But at hour 24, you realize like, wow, I don't think I'm gonna get out in the 12 hours that I thought I was. Up until this point, my highest priority was rescue, hiking out towards, but now I'm out of water. So what I should do is I should finish this last half a liter and now make water my biggest priority. So you find water and then you continue with self-rescue. So that's why I rank it in that. Was that clear? Cool, awesome. Any others before I move on to?
So fire for like getting dry wood.
Yeah.
Or in snowy conditions.
Yep.
What's the best part?
So this is where I always love to be outside when I'm teaching this part of it. It's pointing around to me. But observation. So I was teaching survival school out in the woods 2 weekends ago, 3 weekends ago. And I asked people to observe what they saw around them. I said, and they said, what? And I said, anything. Tell me everything you see that might be useful. And there's a tree, if anyone's seen hemlock trees, they're a type of conifer. I know because I love forestry that hemlocks don't like to have wet roots. That's just evolution, they don't like that. So their needles tend to be very, very good at repelling water. And someone who had no background in forestry was actually an IT guy, was looking around and he goes, I'm noticing that that part of the woods looks a lot drier. And I went, you're 100% right. That part of the woods is a lot drier. That's a hemlock grove there, and you can see that there's a lot less moisture there. So that would be one thing. You know, it's interesting. In the winter, it's easier to find dry wood than it is sometimes in the spring, because in the winter, hopefully you're lucky and everything's locked up as frozen water. Now, if there was some water in wood, it would freeze and you'd have frozen water in the wood. But if you had wood that was already dried and seasoned, so like if a tree fell in March and was out the whole summer and then the first snow fell on it, that'd be great firewood because it would have been drying out in the sun for the spring and summer, and then, you know, it wouldn't have had a chance to rot to the point where it would absorb a lot of water and then freeze into it. But again, this is where observation is going to come into a lot of it. And fire is hugely important, so let's start with fire. Fire is amazing because of all of these things, fire will serve you in the greatest number of ways. We already talked about how fire can purify your water. Fire is also your best friend against thermal challenges if cold is your thermal challenge. Shelter is equally important, but fire is also important in what it does to you psychologically. I've been doing this for years, and every time I start a fire without matches, I still get a little shiver. It just feels so cool because it's such a fundamental force, and to know that you're taming that is really something else. And starting a fire can give you that huge boost of like, I can do this, I got this, like I've got fire. And we've all seen Castaway, you know, like that's legitimate. Like, I've done fire, it feels amazing. Fire can also help you signal for rescue. If you're really injured and there are people looking for you, they're going to be looking for things like a signal fire. So fire is crucial in so many different ways. It's a little difficult. Animals keep animals away, absolutely. Fire is also not as hard of a skill to learn as most people think it is. Fire without matches is a wonderful skill to have, but in your survival kit, there should be at least one method of making fire without, you know, just straight up fire.
In a waterproof container.
In a waterproof container, yep. And again, multi-purpose, like the small things, I've just got a bunch of duct tape wrapped around the side of the lighter, just to have it. You know, it weighs next to nothing, and duct tape is awesome handle. Yeah, it's a little
It's
camo duct tape.
roll.
Yep, just duct tape roll. I have usually duct tape rolled around 3 or 4 things in my survival kit at any given time.
You have to bring a separate duct tape
Nope,
roll.
nope. And I'll tell you what, I have a very well-stocked first aid kit. And 3 years ago, I was treating a wound that I could not get to stop bleeding. We had to evacuate this person. We were about 3 miles back in the woods, but we couldn't move them until the blood stopped. And I had used my wound seal, which is like a particular thing that helps with scabbing. We had the wound high, we had it compressed, but it was still seeping blood. And finally I went, you know what? I know the minute we start walking you, this is gonna say, so I said, I'm gonna duct tape the bandage right over it. We're gonna do it for the 3 miles. When we get to the hospital, they'll take it off, it's not gonna be a problem. But just, you know, as tight as possible, and that stopped the blood. We get to the hospital, and the doctor's immediately like, duct tape works every time. Like, it does, it really does. So duct tape is just, it's super valuable. Some general principles about fire starting. You need 3 things to start a fire. Got here, you need your ignition from somewhere. Then you're going to need something that takes that initial spark and turns it into a flame, and that's tinder. Tinder can be, my favorite type of tinder is birch bark. It's all over the place. Birches are very, very common trees. If you've ever seen a tree that has bark peeling off of it, that's a birch. The shinier it is, the better, because that shine is from the oil content. Birch bark has so much oil in it that if you get a thin enough piece, it will light even when it's wet because of the oil content. And you'll see it when you get birch bark to go, it makes a thick, oily smoke. Wonderful, wonderful tinder. But there's all different types of tinder. Dried grasses will work. A shredded 20 will work, as we mentioned before too. In a survival situation, this is why I tell people to empty their pockets. I've done this and had people empty their pockets and had like a legitimate bundle of, you know, pocket lint. I'm like, that's tinder. That's not dry lint. That is, you can light that. So tinder is going to be the first thing you need. You'll need kindling then to take that little flame, turn it into a little more heat, and then you have enough heat you get enough kindling to then actually burn your fuel. A couple general rules about fire starting. I mentioned conifers, trees with needles. They are almost always softwood. There's only one exception, and it's a very soft hardwood or a very hard softwood, either or. They make wonderful kindling because it's a softwood. So a softwood usually ignites at a lower temperature than a hardwood, which is useful when you're just stoking a fire up. And the other thing, so conifers, evergreen trees, they need to continue their biological process through the winter. In order to do that, they need some type of antifreeze. So that's what pitch, if you ever see pitch or sap coming out of a pine tree, it's flammable because it's antifreeze. So you can, when you use hemlock, even if it's wet, or spruce or pine or anything else with needles, if it's dead dry, sticky stuff burns. Yep. Yeah, I mean, you can even off of the side of a spruce tree, you just scrape the spruce gum, and if you get that lit, it'll burn like wax. So it's very important to know. But if you do a fire with all softwood, you're just going to be continually feeding it because softwood won't leave you any coals. So once you've got a nice little flame going with softwood, then you start to lay, generally speaking, a tree that's tall is a hardwood. It needs to be a hardwood to grow that tall, very simply. The reason that conifers are softwoods is because, again, they keep their foliage through the winter. They need to be able to bend to withstand winter winds and the weight of snow. So that's why conifers tend to be softer. And a maple or an oak or a beech, which is trying to grow up to 100, 120 feet, is generally going to be a harder wood. But again, this is observation. So if you don't know tree species, take your thumb, put it into the side of the wood. If you can dent it with your thumbnail, it's probably softwood. If you can't, it's probably a hardwood. If you can barely dent it, it's either a hard softwood or a soft hardwood. It doesn't really matter. But those are the general principles with fire. To keep a fire going, a fire needs to be fed not only fuel, it needs to be fed oxygen. And I don't know where it went over there, but somewhere around the floor, there's a little metal telescoping tube. Something like that or a pen can be amazing for fire starting because it allows you. Has anybody ever seen dragon breath where you do this and blow in a fire? Okay, so what you're doing is one of those things you can you're focusing your breath to make the fire more effective. I'll find it later if it's not kicking around, no big deal.
So I shouldn't throw away the stainless steel straws I don't use?
No, totally keep those. Yeah, those are very valuable. And yes, don't use plastic straws either.
Well,
Awesome to hear that.
I don't use straws at all. So
No, it's funny. It's so great to see that finally. And that happened so quickly. Everybody went from straws are fine to oh my God, they're killing the sea turtles. And they are. So it's awesome that we stop using them. Yeah, but even I usually carry a big pen in my survival kit. Write messages, and if you need to, you pull the insides out of it and you have a tube. Basically, it's just focusing your breath because fire needs oxygen. And oftentimes,
I have a question about fire.
Yep.
Is there a difference between a signal fire and a regular fire?
Not in the beginning. So it's a fire until you choose to make it signal. When you're looking to signal, you're looking to do one of two things. If you're looking for contrast anytime you're signaling for rescue. So if you're in a snowy landscape and you have a signal fire going, white smoke isn't going to stand out very well. So you'd want something that will darken the smoke. So the idea is you have a fire going and then you have everything nearby that will turn it into a signal fire. So that if you hear a plane or a helicopter coming for rescue, you can then send up a big thing of smoke. So what you might do, if you're in a winter scenario, you might save something that you don't need that you know is going to put up a lot of oily smoke. Like if you've got a piece of plastic, or ideally if you find some rubber or something like that, don't burn the soles of your boots, but if you're wearing your boots and you have a pair of these are my comfy camp sneakers, burn the soles of those. Get those in the fire and send up big, thick clouds of oily smoke. Alternately, on a clear summer day, thick white smoke can stand out very well, and you can get that with vegetation. So again, that's your fire, and that's the thing. Say you're in a scenario, you're out with two friends on an overnight backpacking trip, and you told people where you were going, and on the second day of a 3-day trip, somebody broke their leg. You're 6 miles from the trailhead. You go, we're not going to move. People know where to find us. When we don't come home on Monday night on the long weekend, they're going to look for us. So let's hang tight here, and let's make sure that on Tuesday morning, we're ready so that we know if they send over a search plane, okay, it's a clear day. So let's have a nice big fire going, or have a small fire going and then have one pyre of fuel, so, I hear a plane in the distance. Okay, stoke the fire up. Okay, it's getting closer. Good, the fire's hot enough. put the boughs of green stuff on and let that go. So that's preparation. But yeah, so to answer your question, a signal fire and a fire are the same thing until you put something on it to make that contrast. Yep.
So if you were in a desert environment, you would put up like the white.
Yeah, I would think that would work. Desert, that's a nice thing. Like if they're looking for you in the desert, you're pretty easy to find. That's the nice thing about it. So in that scenario, you might want to think more. I mean, a fire is great to signal with, but in a desert scenario, a Mylar blanket would work really well. If you had a couple colorful pieces of clothing, even that would work very well. And what we're talking about with like adding stuff, that would be what we'd call active signaling. You can also do things that are like passive signaling, where if you're in the desert and it's like your typical like light sand colored desert, like you'd see in Utah, where it's sort of a pinkish, reddish type thing, you could find the darkest rocks possible and arrange them into an unnatural shape. And then you don't have to do anything. Like that can be the first thing you do when you're in a survival situation. So hey, just in case anybody starts looking for me, they'll find that in a hurry, and then I can go worry about building shelter. So, and that's also it's interesting because getting into active and passive very quickly, it's nice when you're active. So a great thing, if you're in the one I always like to give an example of active versus passive, not only that with rescue, but say that you think you might be in a survival situation for a little while. You've got a bad injury and nobody's gonna be looking for you. You think you might need something to eat within a couple of days. You could actively, look to spear frogs, which is gonna take calories, or you could set up a little fish trap and let it go and come back and check on it. So active versus passive is something you always want to think about. Whenever you can do something,
Trap?
yeah, it's pretty simple. You basically just, here's the shoreline, you take some sticks, put them in a V like that, put any kind of bait in the inside of it, the fish will swim in through the narrow aperture, and then once they're in it wide, they can't swim out. Sort of like a lobster trap.
They don't like turn around?
Nope, they don't turn around, they'll continue to get lost. Yeah, it's pretty funny. As long as you space them closely together like that. The last time I set up a fish trap for demonstration, I had literally, I was like, watch, I'm gonna turn this like little 8-calorie piece of beef jerky into 200 calories of fish. And I put it in there, went back to check on it in 2 hours, no fish, but there were a dozen crawdads in there. I'm like, well, those are totally edible. Yeah. Yeah, fish traps are pretty useful. Those are a lot easier to demonstrate when we're in the woods, obviously. But
That's a lot easier than fishing.
that is fishing. And just a quick note on survival food. Everyone thinks that they're going to be eating like, oh, I'm going to trap, chipmunks and deers. If you're in a survival situation, you're probably eating insects and amphibians. Those are your two.
Worms.
Yep, because again, you could, even if you had the skill to trap animals, you're going to expend a lot of energy going around setting up traps. Yep, you could spend about, thanks, I don't mind the interplay, I'm good both ways. You could spend 800 calories going around setting up traps and then only catch like a 200-calorie chipmunk. Frogs, where you're sitting there right over a pond, spearing them, it's gonna be much easier. And I actually have eaten frog legs in the woods. They're not terrible. They're better in a French restaurant with garlic and butter on them, but they're not terrible in the backcountry either. And again, you may not be starving, but the idea of eating a little food can really help with you psychologically, particularly if it's August and you can harvest wild blueberries. It's pretty awesome on that. So we've touched on fire a little bit. We've touched on water a little bit. A couple rules about drinking water. What's going to be the safest water to drink? Clear and moving fast is usually better, but that's not a guarantee because that clear, fast-moving water could be draining out of a beaver pond, and beavers are filthy animals that poop in the water and spread giardia all over the place. Alternately, you could have a pool of water that's coming from a spring that it might look a little muddy, but because it's coming out of the side of the mountain, it's potable. Generally, water that's traveled underground is going to be purified. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it's pretty good. So if you see water springing out of the side of the mountain or seeping out of a rock, 99 times out of 100, that's going to be good to drink. You can collect water if you're in a long-term survival scenario. Again, for the Northeast, water's everywhere. Just find the cleanest source you can consume. If you have a method of boiling or treating, definitely do so. For desert and other scenarios, there are cool things to learn how to do, like setting up solar stills, learning how to trap evaporation. Those are all really cool skills. And if you guys join us upstate, we'll be glad to teach those in a little more detail. But for the most part, if you're thirsty, get yourself hydrated. It's definitely the way to go. So we've covered fire a bit, we've covered water a bit. It really is crucial. And it's something that people often overlook because they think, I can't build something to live in out here. You can. And you usually start with modifying an existing structure. One of my favorite in the Northeast, you find downed trees all the time. You find a tree that's fallen like this, and to make a simple shelter, if this is the tree that's fallen, say here's the stump, this is the tree that's fallen, you simply line up sticks on either side in an A-frame type shape, then you weave within some branches, throw a bunch of leaves and stuff on top of it, and you've made an insulated shelter. The crucial mistake that most people make is, one, they make them too big. You're trying to insulate a space usually. And again, and I'm saying all of this very regionally specific, and that I'm assuming your challenge thermally is going to be getting too cold, which it usually is. That's usually your biggest issue, unless you are in the desert or tropical area. And if anyone's adventuring those places, give me a call. I'd love to talk about that. Tropical places, you got to worry about venomous stuff because things are poisonous in warm areas, generally speaking. Again, not a huge issue in the Northeast, which is really nice that there aren't many things that can kill you other than gravity in most of the mountains up there. People always ask when we're in the Catskills, what's dangerous up here? I tell them gravity. Like that is by far your biggest issue. There are rattlesnakes, but nobody gets bitten by rattlesnakes because, well, all right, my favorite thing I like to say, people get bitten by rattlesnakes when they harass them. The unprovoked rattlesnake bites are incredibly rare. They've gone through the trouble of evolving that rattle so they can warn you to their presence so they don't have to bite you. They don't want to waste their venom on something they can't eat. So you really have to piss off a rattlesnake or really surprise it to get bitten. When I did work out west for one season and snakes were more of an issue, I would always joke that rattlesnakes are attracted to testosterone and alcohol because most rattlesnake bites involve a man between the ages of 18 and 45 who has been consuming alcohol. So there's that. And usually someone's like, maybe it's just drunk guys harassing snakes. Might be that too. So shelter, the two mistakes that people usually make are making them too large because you think, I'm gonna make a fortress, this is gonna be amazing. Well, if you make something with a roof this high, one person's body heat, it's really not gonna do much to raise the temperature in there. If you build one that's just high enough for you to sort of draw yourself in on your elbows, you're probably gonna be pretty warm after a couple hours. The other crucial mistake that people make, and this happens a lot if you're lucky enough to find like an overhanging cave or something like that, the huge mistake people make is failing to insulate from the ground. I talked about losing temperature, losing heat 25 times faster when you're wet. So the three ways we have what's called thermal exchanges. You have convection, which is air. You have radiation, which is heat lost into the air. And then you have finally conduction, which is something on it. Just everybody take a quick second, just feel the ground right here. Just feel the, particularly if you're on the tile. You feel that, right? It's cold. If you're sleeping on that, I don't care how bomber your shelter is above you, you're gonna be cold because your body's just gonna be conducting heat right into the ground. So what you wanna do is create, basically shelter applies the principle of loft, dead space, things like that. So what you're looking to do is you're looking to create first some separation, but more importantly, pockets of stationary air. So one of the ways that you can create a bottom, if you're in a situation, truly survival situation, and you want to harvest some branches, you put those down, you're putting branches with needles or leaves on them, you're creating little pockets of air that eventually your body heat, rather than going into the ground and being conducted away, your body heat's going to warm those little pockets of air and be sucking the heat away. If you're in an area where either A, you can't harvest greenery, one very successful way of doing it is taking logs or sticks that are about that big and putting them down in what's called like a corduroy road. So picture just like a xylophone or just lined like that. Not the most comfortable, but in between each of those logs, again, there are little spaces of dead air. So your body's gonna warm those. And then the cold ground is going to have to try and steal your warmth through that air, through convection, which is not nearly as efficient for heat loss as conduction. So when you're building a shelter, your principles are make sure you insulate from the bottom as well as from the top. Couple other principles of insulation or shelter building, those are the big ones. I mean, there's some subtle things, like if you plan on being there for more than a night or two, having it south or west facing can be good. That's where the solar radiation is gonna be the warmest. Again, if thermal conduction is, if you believe you're gonna have thermal challenges, building a shelter next to rocks can be nice because the rocks will absorb solar radiation through the day, sort of send the heat back to you slowly. So cover this for shelter. I'll move on to rescue. I want to leave a little time for questions at the end. Sarah, I just want to double check time. Because I'm pretty sure the store closes at 8, and I know I'm supposed to go to 8:30.
You said south and west facing.
Yep.
What's facing south or west?
So just if you figure, if you're in an area in the woods and you want to have the entrance to your shelter, you would want that to be facing either south or to the west, so that when the sun is at its most intense part of the day, it'll warm that area. Not a huge, in the forest, you won't get as much of a benefit from that, but if you are in a snowy area and you can have a little sun come in, it makes a small difference. Yep.
When your shelter, is there a preference to have your head near the entrance or maybe a lot of things?
Yeah, so interesting. I know that some people subscribe to the theory that you should actually have the entrance to your shelter be a little bit lower, so that the idea is that cold air sinks, so that if your feet are 6 inches lower than your head, which is what your body wants to keep warm, your body is brutal about keeping your head and your core warm. It's so funny. You would think that when your extremities get cold, if your core is warm, your body would go, oh, my fingers and toes are cold. Let's pump some warm blood there and get everything warmed up. It does the exact opposite. It doesn't want to risk having the blood come back to the core cold. So it, instead of dilating your distal capillaries to, suffuse them with warm blood, it tightens them up and it just basically cuts off the blood flow. So if you keep your head and your core warm, the rest of your body will usually stay warmer. So I would, in that case, put my head towards the top, away from the entrance. When we're in the winter and we build snow shelters, we do what's called the cold air well. So we actually dig a trench in the shelter that's about 1 foot deep, and the cold air sinks into it. And it's crazy because I've taken my thermometer, put it in the bottom of the cold air well, and it's 20 degrees, and then you put it on the sleeping platform and it's 29, 30, and those 10 degrees make a big difference. So quick, I do want to do a little bit, yep. It's 8 now. It is at 8. Cool, thanks. I had a feeling it might be. So I do want to leave some time for questions, and we'll run that pretty quickly. So principles of rescue, very quickly. Look to break the pattern. If you're on a beach, if you're shipwrecked or whatever, do something that looks unnatural. 3 X's in a row with dark rocks on a white sandy beach. If you're in a dark green forest, if you have white clothing that you can spare, or a Mylar blanket, rather than using the 1 Mylar blanket tied to a tree, rip it into 3 pieces. Do something that's going to look unnatural. Remember the rules of 3 whistle blasts, 3 yells. Anything like that will help get you around. So 2 things I want to do. I do want to take questions. I'd also like to offer everyone, one, at the end of this week, we do raffle off 2 trips. So if you'd like to do name and email, and before I send it, I'm just going to make a quick note that this is survival school, so I know which documents to email you guys all at the end. I know I didn't bring quite enough handouts. Cool. General questions? Wow, this would be a first.
What are some techniques for getting dry once you've already been wet?
Yep.
Like if you submerged into the river?
Yeah. So if it's not freezing cold, or even if it is pretty cold, you want to get the moisture out as quickly as possible. So the first thing you can do is strip down, wring your clothes out. Physically manipulate as much water out as possible. I have been in this scenario. I was fishing. This is before I was even a guide. And I turned my canoe in October. And my car was parked like a half a mile away, but it's freezing. I was like, I don't even know if I can walk the half a mile. I was in jeans and a sweatshirt. Like, it was really bad. So I got out, rolled wrung them out as best as I could, then rolled them into a pile and just rolled them on a rock. I got maybe 50% of the water out. When I put them back on, at first it was freezing, but then within a few minutes I went, nope, that was definitely the right decision. If I had been further from my car, I might have started a fire. This winter, we were out camping for 2 nights in one stationary base camp, and we took a day trip to just go snowshoe, and one of our hikers plunged into the river, and just to the knee. And so her entire right leg was soaking wet. And I knew that we had a whole campsite 2 miles away with a fire going. We left a guide there who had kept the fire going. And I really thought, all right, we could really bust it back to camp as quick as possible where there's a fire already waiting for us. I said, or we could actually take 30 minutes here, let me kindle a fire, let it get up to a place where it could warm enough. And we did, because and I made that decision based on the fact that you can look at someone and get a sense of how they're going to do. Like, generally speaking, men create more heat through muscle. Women trap heat more effectively. This was a very skinny woman, and I looked and I went, she could have frostbite within the hour it would take us to hike back, and I didn't want to risk that. So we built the fire and got everybody warmed up, and then headed out from there. So yeah, wringing out the clothes in a worse scenario, build the fire. This being wet is really is tough. Yep. Cool. 1 and then 2 if I can.
Okay, so conserving water is basically nonsense.
again, it'll depend a little bit on that scenario. If I'm in a scenario, if it's August in the Catskills, I might do that a little bit differently. But if you do find yourself, if you're a little thirsty, you're not in the verge of dehydration. But if you're getting this like the tongue feels swollen, you're on the verge of getting dangerously dehydrated. So at that point, so I would say, and again, there's no hard and fast rule, conserve up to the point where you feel like you're getting dehydrated, and at that point, stay on top of it. Sure, that's awesome. Yep. Yep. Yeah, I always carry a compass. And really, any way of treating water that can work. Life Straw is great. These are Aquamira potable tablets. They're a box, a little bit of these in there. Yep. If you carry vitamin C, it neutralizes it. Ascorbic acid completely neutralizes the iodine. You can carry chlorine tablets, but again, also a funky taste, no doubt. But yeah, so I found this out that vitamin C neutralizes the iodine flavor completely and totally. I was really impressed by that. Without messing up the efficacy at all. Yep, you purify it, let it sit for 5 minutes, put your vitamin C in, and it neutralizes the flavor. So yeah, these are just iodine. If I were using them, I'd carry another bottle with vitamin C in them as well. You should always carry some cordage, whether a little bit of pea cord like this, all depends. In the summer, I usually carry a little tube with 1 or 2 fishing lures as well, and like 50 yards of fishing line. I don't have them because I used them yesterday. Little fishing lures with a little bit of line. Again, I use a heavy gauge fishing line so that if I need to use it to tie something, I can, or I can just use it to go ahead and throw the line in the water. See if I couldn't get a fish that way. So recapping, what I have with me, a knife either on your person or in the survival kit, at least 2 sources of starting fire. So this magnesium, this works very simply to kick sparks like that. So one side of it will give you sparks, and the other side you can actually scrape magnesium with. If you scrape a little magnesium and then strike the spark into that, you get a fire that burns briefly, but at about 2,000 or 3,000 degrees. So make sure I've got all that. You'd have cordage, cutting, shelter, water. Those would be the basics. Yep. Yes.
Thanks, this is awesome.
Thank you.
What do you do when you can only find wet wood?
So what you can do at that point, you want to use the small, sure thing. Well, what do you do if you can only find wet wood? So what you do is try and dry things off slowly at a time. So we had this scenario on Saturday night. I was talking to Jessica, my wife, who guided Saturday's trip. She said stuff was really wet on Saturday. She took me about an hour to get a fire going. I expected about that much. And what she did was she had a little bit of birch bark, and she was striking the magnesium. The first couple times it couldn't get it to light, but it at least got the birch bark to dry out a little bit. And then she had just enough birch bark to light, and then she dried off a little bit of kindling, and the kindling went out, but then it was dried with each successive time.
One more question.
Yes?
Would you recommend taking a first aid course at the medical wilderness?
So that's a great question. If you hike frequently, a wilderness first aid course is only 16 hours. You do it usually a Saturday and Sunday, 8 hours each day. Wilderness first aid is awesome. To go a step beyond that, wilderness first responder is like 80 hours, is much more intense. Wilderness first aid is wonderful because they teach you the basics of first aid, and then they teach you and how do you do this with limited materials. So it's really good, and again, a good wilderness first aid instructor will really teach you not just the fundamentals of, immediate, trauma care, but what type of things you can use as a resource when you're in the woods. Strongly recommend that. If you spend time out, particularly if you spend time out in areas where it's difficult to get rescue, crucially. Yeah, and honestly, wilderness first aid is what most of our guides start with. And the ones that go on to do wilderness first responder generally find I feel like I learned a lot more in those 16 hours than I did in the 80. It is true. The wilderness first aid is a great course. Yep.
Actually, just want to add to that. I did the wilderness first aid and the wilderness first responder, and
Yep.
totally true. The 16 hours,
Yep.
you learn almost just as much. And REI does the wilderness first aid classes pretty regularly,
Yep.
if not Outward Bound and
Yep.
the National Outdoor Leadership School or NOLS does
Yep.
classes also for both.
Yep. Yep. And if you take your course in New York, you generally do a regular first aid CPR as well. It's always fun doing that in New York City, at least for the guides, because everyone else is either cop, a firefighter, or you know, a home health aide, and you're like, well, what do we do if a tree falls on someone? That's not going to happen in Brooklyn. Don't worry about that type of thing. Yeah. Yes.
So do you carry like paper maps, or do you rely on? Do you have a separate GPS device?
I use Map and Compass exclusively. I don't own a GPS device. My feeling with GPS, phones, any other type of navigation that is not a Map and Compass, if you're not carrying a Map and Compass, you do not have a way to navigate. If you are carrying a Map and Compass and you want to carry a phone or GPS or anything like that in addition to, awesome. But if you don't have a Map and Compass, you don't have tools to navigate. I know it sounds a little severe, but in the last 3 or 4 years, the number of times that I've been out guiding, people see my badge or my hat and they come up to me holding their phone like, hey, so I'm using this thing where like a guy hikes the trail and takes pictures of all the junctions, and I've been using this to navigate, and I think I missed one because I haven't seen any of these pictures. I'm like, pull out your map. I'll show you where I don't have a map. All right, let me take a picture of your map. Well, what do you have, 14% battery? Okay, that's probably not gonna, no, really, I mean, that's the thing. Having said that, Avenza, A-V-E-N-Z-A, makes phenomenal mapping software. I know a lot of guides that use that as a backup, and they actually use it as their primary, but the guides all have the map and compass skills theoretically locked in for good. Avenza is really good. It works well with the New York, New Jersey Trail Conference maps, which are the popular ones for the Catskills and Hudson Valley. So Avenza is a great one. And the cool thing is, when you treat electronic navigation as a secondary thing, they're like, look, I know how to use a map and compass, but I'm going to pull out my phone and drop a pin at this really cool viewpoint that I found just by going 200 yards off trail. Or this is such an awesome campsite, I want to share this with my friends, and drop a pin, things like that. So the technology is great as a secondary or tertiary quaternary measure.
All right, let's give it up for Dave.
Oh, thank you. Good, Sarah. That's a pleasure. Thank you. Thanks.